So the purpose of this video is to talk through the action reflection learning model that runs throughout the GSF units. For students, you need to get a handle on how the unit is structured so that you're aware of what's required of you through the semester. And you'll also need to be familiar with the process of theological reflection that you'll be using. You'll be using that in your journal writing as well as in the mentoring meetings. If you're a mentor or a prospective mentor, then in this video we want to give you an understanding of where your role fits into the whole unit, as well as introduce you to the process that the mentoring meetings we hope will follow. Now, there's also a companion video to this one that speaks in more detail about the mentoring role, and we trust that together these will give both students and mentors a clear understanding of what's to come in this GSF unit. So starting then with action reflection learning. What we're most familiar with in academic learning is to start with theory and then move towards application. An action reflection approach turns that around and actually makes our experience the launching pad for our learning. So the way that we're going to proceed is to start with students' own spiritual experience and practice. We're asking, how are you as a student experiencing the work of the Spirit to shape you into the likeness of Jesus? And then from that vantage point, we'll then reflect on the insights and the questions, the meaning that arises from that experience. And this then is where the main content of learning comes in. So you'll be drawing on relevant biblical and theological resources that will help to deepen existing understanding. Hopefully also it will be constructing new connections between different parts of your knowledge, as well as perhaps opening up whole new ideas for you to investigate. The point though is that this learning isn't done in an abstract way. The learning is arising out of the student's lived experience of the spiritual life. The goal in all this is to move from sort of unexamined practice and experience to a point of self-awareness and conscious practice. Because we're particularly looking to integrate our conscious thoughts with our practice, our lived experience. And so in the process, it might be that we discover that our actions are inconsistent with our words. So having paid attention to what's going on and thinking carefully about what our actions might mean or imply about our beliefs, well, then we're in a better place to recognise that there are things that might need to change about our actions. But on the other hand, it might also be that it's our words that needs to change. Because sometimes the things that we do are actually more faithful to God than our stated convictions. And I think there is the particular opportunity of action reflection learning. We're able to learn from faithful actions as much as from faithful thinking. Overall, the aim is to develop a deep consistency between our thoughts and our actions. Now, the particular structure that we've given then to the GSF units is to follow 4 cycles of a 5-step action reflection process. The first step is to think. Think refers to the input for students to work through at the beginning of each of the cycles, either in videos such as this or perhaps in written notes or other reading that's in the online classroom. Now, I realise that this looks like the opposite of what I just said, that action reflection learning starts with actions and then moves to theory. Now, the actual first step has been all of the life experience and the Christian spiritual journey that you as a Christian person and as a human person, that journey that you've been on all the way up to this point in your life. The thinking input is not really theory to apply. Instead, these are just some thoughts that are given to orientate students to the aspect of life experience that we particularly want to focus on. So that's step 1, think. Step 2, act. And this is where students will be engaging in actual practices of spiritual formation. So in cycle 2 of this unit, so that's in weeks 4 to 6 of the semester, we're going to introduce you to a set of spiritual practices. And you'll choose one of them and participate in that particular practice through the rest of the unit. There are different practices to choose from, and each of them connects in some way with this theme for GSF Part A of being known by God. In step 3, your experience of those practices will be the basis of your theological reflection recorded in your reflective journal. So that's when you take the things that you've been practicing and do your personal processing of them. Then when you come to step 4, that's where the mentoring meeting comes in. This is the being guided of guided spiritual formation. And as a student, you'll discuss your thoughts and reflections with your personal mentor. Then finally, the 5th step is renew. At this point, the student makes plans for the next cycle of the process. We're thinking about what will you do differently in the light of your reflection on the experience so far. So, what we really need to hone in on is how do you go about that process of reflecting theologically on your practice? What is it that you are to be writing in your journal? What, as a student, what are the sorts of questions and conversation that you should be having, student and mentor, in your mentoring meetings? Now, the GSF units are exercises in practical theology. Now, this title, Practical Theology, isn't just talking about the practical application of theological ideas. No, practical theology is a particular theological discipline that pays attention to the meaning and sort of the theory that's embedded in human action. So in practical theology, we want to think carefully about human action and God's action interact. And we're always aiming toward more faithful and more effective practice in the future. Now, let's unpack that some more by thinking through the 4 main tasks of practical theology. And we're going to frame each task with a key reflective questions. And I would suggest that these are the questions that you could use to work through in your reflective journal as you reflect on your experience. And they're the same questions that could guide the conversation that you have, mentor and student, together. The first task of practical theology is to describe our experience. And here we're asking the question, what happened? What we want to do at this point is to pay close attention to your actual experience, since that's going to be the basis of your ongoing reflection. You know, what often happens in our thinking about our practice is that we react to circumstances. And often those reactions are based on what we think happened or what we assume happened, when the reality might actually be quite different. So to avoid that, your first task is to take time to think carefully about your experience. So what actually happened? What was said? Who said what to whom? What actions were done? What was the body language at the time? Think about the physical environment that you were in. What else was going on around about? What else was going on in your life at the time? Who were the other people that were involved? Think about also what was going on for you, in you, in that experience. What did you do? What did you see and hear and feel, smell, touch, taste? Think about what were you thinking at the time? What emotions were aroused for you? What memories were evoked? What desires did the experience connect with? Do you see, what we are trying to do is to probe the experience to see exactly what's there, so that we know what it is that we're dealing with. Now, in the mentoring meeting, mentors can be particularly helpful here by asking good investigative questions. And as a mentor, I would suggest that you stick with those descriptive questions, that descriptive task, until you've got a clear picture of the experience that the student is reflecting on. The next step then, having done our careful description, is to explore what all of this might mean. This analytic task is an opportunity to explore sort of in and behind and around the description, to see what insights might arise out of this experience. So you might want to explore the reasons why certain things occurred or didn't occur, or why certain responses were made. Perhaps there are connections that you're thinking about that connect with other experiences, other similar experiences, or perhaps contrasting experiences. There might be connections with ideas or theories that you're already familiar with. The analysis might also bring up questions that you're going to need to explore further. What you'll discover is that reflecting on one incident or one experience will often present lots of different things to explore. And it doesn't really matter which path you choose. Some will strike you as being more interesting to you at the time, so feel free to just go with that instinct. Remember, though, that this is a unit in spiritual formation, so you should focus your reflection on that aspect of the particular experience. So, for example, perhaps the spiritual practice that you're reflecting on is about the student going to a prayer meeting at church. And in the descriptive task, the student notes that there were only a handful of people there, and that group prayed for an hour or so for various things in the life of the church. But then the student remembers also being quite sort of distracted and irritated during the meeting. And then in the conversation with their ministry supervisor, the student, you recognise that you were quite disappointed in what was going on. And when you expressed that to your supervisor, well, your supervisor was quite surprised because they'd been really encouraged by the whole thing. So there's a mini description of an event. Now, how would you pursue an analysis of that experience? Well, what you could do is begin to think through what makes people decide to attend prayer meetings or not. Why was there only a handful of people that turned up to a meeting to pray about the concerns in the life of the church? Now, with that question in mind, you might need to go back to your descriptive task and think a bit more about how the meeting was promoted and when it was held and any other factors that might influence why people turned up or not. What was the weather like at the time? Now, the question of what encourages people to turn up to a prayer meeting is a great question to consider in ministry. But it's more appropriate to a unit on practical ministry than on personal spirituality. So for GSF, a more pertinent question would be, why did you as the student feel distracted and irritated by what went on at that prayer meeting? Why were you disappointed with the meeting? You might want to explore how those feelings influenced how you personally engaged with God during the prayer time. Another line of analysis would be to think about what effect the experience of this prayer meeting has had on your feelings and attitudes towards other people at church. Now, this is the point where a mentor is really helpful in the process. Because for mentors, as a fresh set of eyes to the experience, then you're able to perhaps point out aspects of what happened that the student may not have paid enough attention to. Or you could redirect their analysis to areas that might be more fruitful in relation to the student's spiritual formation. Now, you also are able to reflect back to the student those times that they got perhaps particularly animated in their retelling of this event. There might be certain aspects of what happened that you can see that they're more emotionally engaged with that might be more obvious to you than it is to them. In all this, remember, as a mentor, the most important thing for you is to be guiding this reflection, but not to be taking over. Mentors do need to restrain themselves from imposing their own interpretations on this situation. We're really glad that you are there, but we hope that you would be able to help the student as a learner develop their own self-awareness, their own skills in critical reflection. So the best thing that you as a mentor can be doing at that point is to listen carefully and ask really good questions. Now, the thing is, until now, we haven't looked at the Bible or thought explicitly about theology at all. That's not because we think it's unimportant. It's just that this task can't stand on its own in this practical theological process. Because it's not until we've got a good handle on the situation, and it's not until we've got some sort of clarity about which aspect of the situation we're particularly interested in exploring, Until we've got those two things in place, we can't really start thinking theologically about what ought to be happening in this situation. But once we're there, well, this is the point where you want to start drawing on all of your accumulated wisdom through your study of the Bible and theology and church history and ministry and mission, all of your theological insight, all of the theological insight built up over your whole life, really, and you bring all of that to bear on this particular issue that you're exploring. From what you've come to know of God and of the Christian story, we want to ask, what direction do we get for what ought to happen in this situation? And this, I think, is what makes practical theology so challenging and so interesting. We don't have any of the ease and clarity of a theological exam. When you head into that test with neat divisions between different parts of the curriculum, knowing which subject you need to have in the forefront of your mind for any particular day. When we're reflecting on actual life experiences, we need to draw from all manner of different fields of knowledge and begin to integrate those areas of knowledge to relate to the experiences of life. So, at this point in the process, what you're going to be doing is thinking about relevant passages of the Bible, key doctrines or theological themes that relate to this situation that you're considering. There might also be a sense of established traditions or patterns of practice from the past, the tried and true methods, and they might also help direct your action in the future. Now, once again, a mentor can be particularly helpful at this stage because you bring an extra brain to the reflection. So you might want to suggest other passages of Scripture or other theological themes that could be explored in more detail. Just remember again that the mentor's role is to guide the students in their own reflection rather than taking over and dictating your own conclusions. So we come then after that directive stage to the final stage of the reflective process, and that is to return to lived experience to consider how will we respond now in light of all the reflection that we've done. Now, sometimes the response is a fairly straightforward adjustment to a particular action. Sort of, next time, instead of doing X, I'm going to do Y. And that can be quite helpful to come to. But often in spiritual reflection, there won't be a clear action to improve on. Instead, there might be various possibilities for how a new insight might be embodied in your future life and ministry. So going back to our illustration from before, perhaps you realise that from your experience of attending that prayer meeting, that it's refocused your attention on God's sovereignty and how that relates to issues that you have with anger and disappointment. If God in His sovereignty decided that there were going to be a handful of people at the prayer meeting, then who are we to be disappointed and particularly angered or irritated by those that are there? Now, that reflection might actually lead you to think about being less aggressive in a conflict with a person that you're involved in. So what you see is that we've moved from a prayer meeting to a conflict resolution situation, and we've made a connection between the doctrine of God and an aspect of Christian character. And there's part of the sort of the surprise and the complexity of this sort of practical theological reflection. The thing to remember for this final task is that while the work of direction will have suggested broad avenues of possible future practice, this final stage is aiming to be as concrete as possible. Any theological insight is going to have wide-ranging implications. The aim here is to find at least one concrete way that your lived experience could embody what it is that you've reflected on. Now, one perhaps helpful way to scaffold this task is just to think of a set of traffic lights. You take the red light of the traffic lights. What is something that would be appropriate to stop doing in light of this reflection? The orange light asks, what is something that would be appropriate to revise or adjust in light of what we've thought through? And the green light, or what's something that would be appropriate to begin doing or to continue doing with some renewed focus? So there you are. There are the 4 tasks and the 4 key questions for a process of practical theological reflection. The last thing to say on that is that you'll rarely follow those 4 neat steps from beginning to end, step 1, step 2, step 3, and then step 4. You'll start with description, you'll need to start there, and you need to end with concrete response. But along the way, then your analysis might throw you back to describe other aspects of what happened that you hadn't paid enough attention to before. And perhaps when you come to the biblical and theological input, you might realise that there's a different way to explain what happened, and so you revise your analysis, and then you take that renewed analysis into your theological reflection and so on. And so you're sort of moving through these 4 steps back and forward. So maybe rather than thinking of 4 clear steps to work through, think of these questions as 4 necessary perspectives from which you'll examine your spiritual life and experience. And also realise that having come to a practical response, what you've really come to is a new experience of spiritual formation that becomes the launching point for a new process of reflection. So there's an overview of an action reflection learning process. It's proven to be very useful in helping to integrate theological understanding with Christian life and ministry. I hope the process can be of benefit to you also.